13th Humanities in the Age lecturer, Professor Carsten.
Thank you for coming, I really appreciate it. Thank you to Marco, Roland, and the other members of the organizing committee for inviting me. I'm very grateful, honored to be here. I've never been to Nebraska before. So, and I saw the wonderful state capitol building first, and that was quite a sight. I was really impressed. I also want to just echo what Mark, I think it's a wonderful series you guys have going here. I think it's a great treat to look at what's being done in interdisciplinary work with the humanities, and I really feel inspired almost to carry something similar home to Missouri. I think it's wonderful what you've done. It's great that you all come to it. I work on evolutionary theory and its influence in the humanities and the social sciences. And in my title today, I refer to the crisis of economics, by which I mean the rising and increasing abstraction from lived experience that characterizes the mainstream neoclassical model used by economists to analyze human and market behavior. And I'll explain what that is. Now, my use of the term crisis then somewhat departs from how Marco and Roland employ the term in the description of their series. If I understand them correctly, their focus lies more on how the very notion of crisis itself has become economized. That is, how crisis today often functions as a rhetorical tool that ultimately helps to bolster the same economic logic it ostensibly critiques. By contrast, when I speak of the crisis of economics here today, I refer to what I think is a genuine epistemological crisis that continues to be disavowed by major scholars in economics, but has recently been acknowledged, and continues to be acknowledged more and more by scholars from within the own discipline, within the discipline of economics, in growing subfields like behavioral economics, evolutionary economics, and the like. So, although it's true that economists often talk about crisis precisely in order to keep the existing economic system in place, as Marco and Roland point out, I will discuss what I think is a real crisis of economic thinking, one that is not taken seriously by the mainstream field, but that in my view has the potential to shake up the entire discipline and its woefully under-theorized notion of economic man, Homo economicus. So to make that case, I will look in this talk at the influence of evolutionary theory in 20th century economics. And I'll refer to scholarly works by Thorsten Veblen, Joseph Schumpeter, Geoffrey M. Hodgson, and other economic thinkers who have contributed to the rise of evolutionary economics. Given the increasing influence of biotechnology in the life sciences for the development of global capitalism and markets, one might reasonably assume, indeed, that evolutionary and behavioral theory provide an important epistemological tool to study the development of markets. Humanities scholars, for one, I would argue, have been quick to identify the morphed nature of today's capitalism as biocapitalism, hence the term in my title today. According to Kaushik Sundararajan, who published a book at Duke University Press about 6-7 years ago, biocapital, and I quote, represents a new face and a new phase of capitalism because it includes the circulation of new and particular forms of currency, such as biological material and information. So Rajan's argument is that biological knowledge is increasingly commodified, both within the academy and on the world market. Operating in tandem with the pharmaceutical companies and other biotechnologies, genomic research can thus not only create new forms of life, but stands poised to reconceptualize life itself as a commercial product on its own. As Nicholas Rose puts it in an important book called The Politics of Life Itself, and I quote again, our very biological life itself has entered the domain of decision and choice. We have entered the age of vital politics, of semantic ethics, and biological responsibility. So life itself has become a product. It's become a commodity to be exchanged and sold on markets. So we're not just only witnessing a different phase in the development of capitalism, as Rajan argues, we're also engaging in a new form of governmentality that Michel Foucault famously called biopower or biopolitics, and that's a reference to the series that you had 2 years ago. Now, biopower, Foucault had scattered arguments about biopower in his later 70 lecture in the years 1970s. He had lectures at the college, and it was never a real fully coherently made concept, and critics today continue to draw from Foucault's somewhat scattered cryptic remarks on what biopolitics is. But the basic idea is, as Foucault says, that biopolitics describes the set of mechanisms through which the basic biological features of the human species became the object of a political strategy, of a general strategy of power. So according to Foucault, biopower replaces the previous form of political control, which he called sovereignty over death, with a new form of political control, namely the regularization of life. And I quote, "One, that is the first one, sovereignty over death, is a technology in which the body is individualized as an organism endowed with capacities, while the other, the second, biopolitics, is a technology in which bodies are replaced by general biological processes." So there's a shift here, according to Foucault, in how power operates. It no longer focuses on punishing single individuals, that was the previous mode, but instead now aims to establish a brave new world of entire populations engineered to obey. That's the shift from repressive power working on the individual body towards a regulatory biopower that moves into creating life, making life certain and breeding, engineering certain propensities towards government that easily lend themselves towards government control, a shift from individual to populations. Now, I will return to this debate about biopower later in my talk. At this point, I really want to emphasize that the rise of biocapital and biopolitics represents a major politico-economic shift for the development of global markets in the 21st century. But there's also a second epistemological consequence that ensues from the academic hegemony of today's genomic research, namely the increasing influence of evolutionary theory and neuroscience in both the humanities and the social sciences. Scholars in all fields, it seems, must come to terms with the biological understanding of human nature, a nature that appears to be severely constrained by our genetically determined mental architecture inherited some 100,000 years ago from our ancestors during the Pleistocene era, as a vocal group of neo-Darwinians and evolutionary psychologists have argued. And by those, I won't go into much of it, but Richard Dawkins is probably one of the more important ones. We talked about him this afternoon in a great discussion section we had in Roland's class. Daniel Dennett, a philosopher, Toby and Cosmides, they're anthropologists, Steven Pinker, the linguist, who's continuously, these are all what I mean by evolutionary psychologists and neo-Darwinians. Neo-Darwinists argue that we do the things we do because we're genetically pre-programmed to do them. Much like human individuals struggle to survive the process of natural and sexual selection, the selfish gene at the molecular level struggles to replicate itself at the expense of its rivals. In my current book on bioaesthetics, I examine these theories in great detail and critically, and study their rising influence in traditional aesthetics and political philosophy today. In that book, I argue that neo-Darwinism is marred by a limited understanding of evolutionary theory. That is a cursory reading of Darwin, I would argue. And I'm not making the own, others have made this argument at great length. Elizabeth Ross, I mentioned her, Evelyn Fox-Keller. There's a lot of humanities-oriented scholars that have shown that Darwin's texts, much like Marx's, I would say, are much more ambivalent, leave open many more possibilities of interpretation than the neo-Darwinians argue, that there's a closing down happening there. We have to talk about that. So they suffer from a bad reading, I would say a bad hermeneutics of Darwin, but maybe more problematically, neo-Darwinians, I think, suffer from a precipitous, indeed dangerous, I'd say, extension of Darwinian evolutionary science from the single biological organism to the socio-cultural realm of human populations. To be sure, I don't deny that human cultural evolution, including economic evolution, is severely constrained by human genetics and inherent psychological predispositions. As a matter of fact, I'm going to use that argument later on against neoclassical economics. At the same time, however, there's clear evidence that the evolution of human culture features emergent properties that are irreducible to biology and remain unpredictable in their specific effects. What drives cultural, economic, social, political evolution is human creativity at the social level, rather than random genetic mutations or the selfish gene at the molecular level, which is why the former cannot be reduced to the latter. The effort to explain cultural evolution exclusively in terms of biological evolution, that is, to turn cultural evolution and to hitch it back exclusively on to biological evolution, would be tantamount to trying to explain people's political views about, say, abortion or Obamacare by scanning their brains or identifying the individual genetic makeup. I've learned this afternoon that this indeed is something that is being done, and I'd love to talk more to people who do it. I'm serious about it. I think it'd be it doesn't strike me as a reasonable approach. Of course, people's brains inform their beliefs. But that does not mean that neuronal activity in the brain is the best place to look for reasonable answers to our political and economic questions. It's simply the wrong level of analysis and a dead-end perspective, I think, for productive research in the humanities. Now, the reason I mention these debates about biopower and new Darwinian theory is to demonstrate that today's humanities scholars, by and far, I think, are attuned to the fundamental epistemological and politico-economic shifts inaugurated by the hegemony of the life sciences and biotechnologies in scholarly research and market developments. By contrast, mainstream economic theory has remained largely unaffected by these developments, with the exception of the subgroup of evolutionary economists I mentioned earlier. On the contrary, the mainstream neoclassical model of economic man, a man whose behavior is ostensibly guided by rational choices in pursuit of self-interested goals, this concept of economic man systematically excludes empirical evidence that testifies to the many irrational predispositions and non-utilitarian motives influencing human economic behavior and general behavior. As I hope to demonstrate in this talk, this recognition of the emotional affective dimension in human nature, in tandem with the ethical concerns that influence human decision-making processes, renders the nascent field of evolutionary economy incompatible with the neoclassical mainstream. Economic theory, and that's my key argument or key thesis, finds itself thus in a double bind. It can either continue to embrace its impoverished concept of economic man at the cost of simplifying the ever-increasing complexity of economic systems, or alternatively, it must come to terms with the limited purview of the neoclassical model at the cost of having to re-examine the basic anthropological and methodological assumptions of its own discipline. So that's my overall thesis. But I want to guide us into explaining and hopefully sustaining this thesis by returning once again to the humanities. In his 1999 manifesto, A Darwinian Left, Peter Singer argues that after the collapse of communism, quote, the left needs a new paradigm in order to correct its long-held and mistaken belief that there is no fixed human nature. A belief that, according to Singer, continues to shape the left's knee-jerk rejection of evolutionary theory. Most leftist thinkers, Singer claims, profoundly misunderstand Darwinian theory. They identify it exclusively with the ruthless struggle for existence as elaborated by right-wing ideologues during the 19th century. And here I think of Herbert Spencer, of course, who talked about the survival of the fittest. It's not a term you find in Darwin. It's a Spencerian twist on Darwinian theory. As we know, this misinterpretation of Darwin contributed to the rise of 20th century totalitarianism and its racist politics of social Darwinism. So by contrast, Singer rightly argues that Darwinian theory lends itself just as well to the social study of cooperative rather than just competitive behavior among humans. Cooperation can increase a species or individual's chance for survival and reproduction, as numerous biologists have pointed out since the 1960s. The left, however, according to Singer, never explored any of these possibilities. Quote, the ultimate reason why the left rejected Darwinian thought, according to Singer, is that, quote, it dashed the left's great dream, the perfectibility of man. For man to be perfectible, the left had to assume that there is no fixed human nature. Hence, again this is Singer, Marxist thinkers from Engels and Lenin to Lysenko and official Soviet anthropology throughout much of the 20th century concluded that Marx's inquiry began precisely where Darwin's inquiry ends, meaning that human cultural evolution is more or less unconstrained, independent, autonomous from human nature and cannot, or indeed must not, be understood in biological terms, lest the utopian goals of leftist politics become unattainable. If human nature is constrained, evolutionary in that way, then no social program, no political incentives will lead to a perfect, more socially community-oriented society, which is the leftist dream. Singer thus explicitly lines himself with and draws scientific evidence from the kind of neo-Darwinian thought I mentioned above. He very much emphasizes the constraints in human nature. Given these evolutionary constraints, Singer cautions, quote, that those seeking to reshape society must understand the tendencies inherent in human beings, which means that the leftist dreams of perfectibility should be put behind us. End quote. Now, there are numerous shortcomings in Singer's book, as his critics were quick to point out. Marx did, after all, develop a biocultural anthropology, particularly in his early writings, the thesis of Feuerbach, German ideology, in the 1844 manuscripts. The human being for Marx is a laboring animal that can realize itself as human only in and through the deliberate, goal-oriented action called labor. Marx has specific passages where he says that is that goal orientation that distinguishes human activity from activity of other animals. A distinction that, of course, has also been challenged recently, precisely by some of the post-humanists, biopolitical interested scholars that we may have mentioned in this context. But my point is simply that it's misleading to argue that historical materialism simply denies the existence of human nature, or believes it to be completely changing with every change in the mode of production, as Singer claims. Marx was not anti-Darwinian. He merely considered human nature more adaptable and less constrained by biology than Darwin, or what he thought Darwin was saying. I think there may also be a slight misunderstanding on Marx's part. Because we know that Darwin himself was not a neo-Darwinian. Much like Marx, you may recall, did not consider himself a Marxist. There's a great famous passage that Engels quotes when Marx says that one thing is for sure, it's that I am not a Marxist. And I've always found that distinction for me quite helpful. For both Darwin and Marx, human cultural development plays a significantly more important role than in today's neo-Darwinian theory. Indeed, it bears repeating that much of the confusion surrounding the left's alleged rejection of human nature in the last century is due to the historical influence of Engels and Lenin's writing, to say nothing of Stalin's contributions, which effectively severed culture from nature instead of acknowledging the complex feedback loops between these two levels. Engels' anti-Düring, for example, stressed the linear teleological development towards communism at the expense of Marx's own and far more subtle reflections on the relation between nature, science, and history. Early Marx, I think, still has relevance today and can provide helpful insights for a critique of neo-Darwinian theory, as well as contribute to the current debate about biopolitics. But Marx aside, my main point is that Singer's critique of the left is misdirected. It is not primarily the humanities and the political left that need to reacquaint themselves with scientific studies on human nature, but rather liberal conservative thinkers who still advocate the impoverished notion of economic man as the scientific basis for economic theory. So let me turn now to this notion of economic man in greater detail to make my case. Now, Let me read three specific characterizations of what economic man is, how economic theory operates, or on what it operates. And when I talk about the neoclassical model, that's a model that basically goes back to Adam Smith, Bastian Say in the 18th century, and then ends pretty much with the Chicago School today, Milton Friedman, emphasis on the individual. And so let me list those 3 points real quick. 1, neoclassical economic theory shows an exclusive concern with utility maximation and rational choices made by individuals. 2nd, it has a strong focus on market equilibrium and exogenous preferences. And 3rd, it shows a total absence of chronic information problems. Let me go through these points and try to explain what they mean. But before I do that, I want to emphasize that by hitting these 3 points, I'm kind of presenting a rather simplified picture. There have, of course, been modifications to these specific premises throughout the 20th century economic history. And I'll touch upon some of them, mostly by the Austrian school. Schumpeter, Hayek, Keynes obviously come from a different direction. And my point, however, is, and that's not a point I'm making, but that I'm taking really from evolutionary economists in the field, is that this mainstream model and the basic premises have remained intact. They are still the core of what economic theorists do when it comes to question of who is economic man, what is the basis of our analysis of market behavior, who is the subject here, and that is economic man. So, let me go through it. First, exclusive concern with utility maximation and rational choice made by individuals. According to the neoclassical model of Homo economicus, human behavior, market behavior, is driven by rational choices made by single individuals in pursuit of a utilitarian goal to satisfy personal needs and desires. This is what Adam Smith meant when he talked about the invisible hand of the market. Quote, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner," famously said, "but from their regard to their own interest." So the idea of the invisible hand by Adam Smith, this notion is that everybody pursues their own personal interest, and the invisible hand arranges it such that the economic totality of these interests leads to an equilibrium, a fair and balanced distribution of wealth. Now there are numerous problems with these assumptions, and let me just briefly address what I think are the 2 main ones. First, it's simply incorrect to claim that rationally pursuit of profit maximation is the sole or even the main driving force steering individual behavior. Our decisions are equally, if not more so, driven by affective habits and by personal, often irrational beliefs in what we consider to be fair, equal, and right. And we are reluctant to give up our beliefs even when confronted with verifiable evidence that contradicts them. Numerous psychological studies have shown that human beings instead tend to invent species counter-arguments in order to disqualify the evidence and confirm their recent, previously held beliefs. There's an easy evolutionary explanation for this pervasive reluctance of humans to change their personal habits and beliefs, which is that many such habits and beliefs have proven useful in our species' ancestral past, at a time when quick decisions, guided by inherited mental schemata and motoric skills, were crucial for human survival. This example is there's good reason that you want to be able to respond quickly to a situation you're confronted with, rather than having the luxury of the professor to think through all the ins and outs. It's usually not a luxury people can afford, particularly the more primitive your environment is and the more dangerous, the more in danger you are. So, put differently, there are good evolutionary reasons why people tend to react impulsively rather than rationally, because it economizes the processing of new information and enables a quicker response. This logic, I want to emphasize, applies to both the phylogenetic and the ontogenetic level. It's valid for both species and the individual alike. This brings me to a second main objection against the rational choice bias of economic man, namely that it fails to account for individuals' altruistic behavior oriented towards the common good, or what the individual perceives to be the common good. As I mentioned earlier, the lingering misunderstandings of Darwin's theory as primarily even exclusively concerned with competition rather than cooperation among individuals, has led mainstream economics to dismiss altruistic social behavior as an anomaly unworthy of further economic reflection. Instead, the rational choice paradigm is often defended with reference to game theory, the prisoner's dilemma. You can get a better deal for yourself, but you have to slightly put the other one at a risk or let him hang out to dry. And there are various examples of these dilemmas. The ones that I have looked at, it's a vast field. The ones that I've looked at, however, to me suggest the opposite. That is, they suggest that most people instinctively balance their personal own selfish interest with altruistic considerations about social fairness and equality. To give a brief example of this, let's assume the following scenario. You are given $10, which you are free to share with another person, a partner, any way you see fit. However, if your partner, the other person, rejects your offer, neither of you gets anything. Now, rationality dictates that you should offer as little as possible short of nothing. And the logic is very simple. The more I get more, and it's still better for you to accept the $1 or $2 I offer you than waiting for the 5. If you reject the $2 I offer you, you get nothing. I also don't get nothing, but that doesn't change the fact that you don't get anything. So rationally, it is of course good for me to offer little short of nothing. If I offer nothing, you certainly won't to reject. Okay? What happens, however, is that most people offer their partner around 50% of the spoils. Some were in that vicinity, 4, 5, some offer more, actually, rather than say only $1. To be sure, you may argue that this choice to offer half does not really betray genuine altruistic behavior, but is instead based on the reasonable and rational calculation yourself that your partner will reject a lower offer, lower than 50%. But this only proves that you are aware that your partner may not respond rationally, but emotionally to your offer, because she may feel offended and willing to renounce her profit in favor of protecting a sense of personal integrity and self-worth. In other words, the partner may say, I don't need your $2, just telling you off makes me feel better, and I renounce the $2, which, if you think about your personal life, happens quite a lot. We do it constantly. We think we've been cheated, this is not right, and oftentimes we're wrong in thinking that we weren't treated right, and that leads to a different point. But what I'm trying to say here is that that rational choice, contrary to the neoclassical assumption, is only one among many factors determining human behavior. Let me move on to the second point on my list, namely that mainstream economics' strong focus, or that is mainstream economics' strong focus on market equilibrium. Now, market equilibrium is based on a quasi-mechanical supply and demand model of economic exchange. And it clearly bears the Newtonian physics mechanical notion of an Enlightenment 18th, 19th century model. It's quasi-mechanical. The theory assumes that a given group of interacting individuals will quickly settle into a state of economic equilibrium. That's the invisible hand that I mentioned. This economic equilibrium is structurally determined by the mutually constraining effects of market prices and consumers' individual purchasing power. That's the price. Okay? This equilibrium signifies, or the price, that each individual has or will be able to maximize its economic utility by making rational choices based on their own best interest. The main problem with this model is that once economic equilibrium has been established, there seems to exist little, in fact no, motivation for any human or corporate agent to change or alter their behavior. Why then does disequilibrium occur at all? Why do markets boom and crash? Why do some markets wither while new ones emerge? And what structures or controls the economic transitions between these markets? Given its dual focus on the optimizing hypothesis, that is, individuals make rational choices based on their own personal interests, and the equilibrium concept, Neoclassical theory is forced to ignore these questions of disequilibrium by and large. Instead, it focuses on the economic effects of disruption of markets, but disregards what causes such disruptions in the first place, because mainstream economics considers such causes to lie outside the purview of economic theory. So that's the basic idea, is that's not, yes, disequilibrium happens, but it happens for multiple causes, and those do not concern me, the economist. I only deal with when the system gets shocked, for whatever reason, and then I look at how equilibrium is being reestablished again. That's what I meant with exogenous preferences. It disregards, classical theory disregards the causes, the origins of disruptions of economic systems. This disregard for the temporal dynamics of market change fueled Joseph Schumpeter's critique of neoclassical economics. And Schumpeter famously introduced the innovative entrepreneur as the major force disrupting market equilibrium. Schumpeter said it is very much an economic factor, and it's the human creativity of the entrepreneur. The Republican Party would certainly agree. I made this, I have it, and that's an economic fact, according to Schumpeter. But Schumpeter's early critique, and he wrote papers on this, he was the enfant terrible of the Austrian school, he wrote papers on this in the early teens and 20s of the 20th century. But his critique had no lasting impact on mainstream economics either then or now. And the main reason for this failure, I think, is that Schumpeter's model of market evolution and disruptions did not really seek to replace its neoclassical rival, but merely sought to augment it. He sought to append his analysis of disequilibrium to the previous model of equilibrium without, however, being able to reconcile the different, if not mutually exclusive, premises on which these two theories are based. In other words, I regard Schumpeter's theory as a perfect model of somebody trying to amend and change the classical model, but running a run who's basically rejected across the board, even by those whom he admired, Walras, for example. He was a great fan, and he wrote a letter where he said, I don't understand why you're rejecting me. I'm not trying to get rid of your equilibrium theory, I'm just trying to add something on. And I think the Walras and others rightly understood that this tag-on, this evolutionary aspect, the temporal dynamics that Schumpeter introduced, would actually unsettle and completely implode the economic model. That's why they rallied the wagons around economic man. That'd be my reading. I'm happy to discuss this. So, this refusal, or better put, the structural inability of the neoclassical model to move beyond economic man and market equilibrium leads me to the last of the 3 points listed above. Namely that economics or economists' deliberate attraction from chronic information problems that severely constrain the allegedly rational choice made by individual consumers. Once again, it was a member of the Austrian school, in particular Friedrich Hayek, who argued that the problem of information deficit that individuals encounter in market situations cannot be overcome simply by introducing the concept of probabilistic risk, as mainstream economics often do. They argue, yes, we don't have all information when we make a rational choice, but we have some, and we are therefore extrapolating on the basis of the information we have and enter into probabilistic risk. We say it's probably like this, and base our rational choice on that. That's mainstream economics' answer to the fact that information is unevenly distributed and unevenly accessible for all rational agents. The problem with that is that the concept of probabilistic risk still excludes phenomena such as severe ignorance and uncertainty, where by definition, I'm quoting here, where by definition no probability can be calculated. That's Keynes, saying if you're completely ignorant, you have no basis for probability. And I'd say many of us are ignorant when it comes to rational decisions about healthcare is a great, but complex economic decisions, you don't always know exactly or hardly anything about what should determine your decision. Probabilistic risk also excludes the empirical fact that different individuals will interpret the same information differently. and come to different conclusions about how to respond to such information. Without that unevenness, I think the humanities would be superfluous, as would be legal scholars. What does the Fourth Amendment mean? Well, you pay the lawyers and you let it, it's not clear what information means. It's not clear that we access the same information, nor is it clear that even if we had all the same information, and we would understand the same information correctly, that we would deduce which action is necessary to act in accordance with that information. These are all steps that are by no means self-evident. And importantly, that disagreement does not mean that anybody acts irrational. It could be that somebody acts irrational when they come to a certain conclusion. But more often than not, everybody will claim I'm acting rationally. It's not clear how that is supposed to be balanced out in economic theory. Now, neoclassical economics, by contrast, and again I quote here from an evolutionary economist who's critical of that, by contrast, quote, typically assumes that all individuals will have access to the same information and interpret it in the same way, and will ignore possible variations in the cognitive frameworks that are necessary to make sense of data. That's Hodges' 2013. Now, if economics were to challenge this assumption that all individuals have access to the same information at the same time and all draw the same conclusions about it, they would quickly, if one were to challenge that, one would quickly find oneself confronted with the social political problem of how to ensure that all community members have equal access to and equal ability to make sense of the economic data that is supposedly driving and determining their rational choice and maximize their profits. I'm sure we can all agree that given the inequity of accessible knowledge, not only within Western societies, but across the global market, there's little reason to assume that this will ever be the case. So, given what I think are really seriously flawed epistemological and methodological assumptions of neoclassical economic theory, why does it remain in place today? Although it has been criticized as idealist throughout the 20th century. Put differently, why did this impoverished and ill-conceived notion of Homo economicus establish itself in the first place? In a well-known essay entitled Why Economics is Not an Evolutionary Science, Torsten Veblen tried to answer this question about a century ago. And Veblen pointed out that the neoclassical concept of economic man, I quote, was never intended to serve as a competent expression of fact, but merely represented an expedient of abstract reasoning. In other words, the reason why early economists originally invented Homo economicus was to simplify the otherwise exorbitant complexity of economic behavior. Economic man was a child of the Enlightenment. He was born of the need to transform economics into a proper science, which in turn required the development of analytical models that rendered human and market behavior quantifiable and calculable. Economic man, in other words, was created so that economic science could thrive. But instead of continuously improving upon this purely conceived brainchild over time and nurture it to maturity, neoclassical economics instead developed ever more complex algorithmic and mathematical tools to keep the homunculus of economic man alive. Although Gabriel Tarde, unlike Veblen, was not an early advocate of evolutionary economics, he came to the same basic conclusion. Tarde claimed that classical economics' exclusive focus on rational choice to increase one's monetary profit, as opposed to, say, to increase one's personal glory, or a maximum of free time, where you don't do anything, essentially confuses what Tarde called the measured measurement, value, with the measuring measurement, money. It confused values with an identified value with money. It equated value with money and therefore confused that which economists need to explain, namely the plurality of human values, beliefs, and desires that together constitute what Tarde called the passionate interests of human beings. This plurality of values was confused with the simplified method of accounting for these values. That is, the common denominator can be money. Once the substitution of value by money had established itself, economic theory could safely disregard everything that resisted being quantified in monetary terms, and instead focus exclusively, or almost exclusively, on those aspects of the human life world that most easily lend themselves to this monetary quantification. Let me quote Tarr to get that more clear. Quote, "In inventing Homo economicus," Tarr claimed, "economists have engaged in a double abstraction. First, the abstraction of having conceived of a man with nothing human in his heart. And second, of having represented this individual as detached from any group, corporation, sect, party, homeland, or association of any sort. This second simplification is no less mutilating than the first, whence it derives." Tarr's crucial point, however, and this is an important point, was not to denounce quantification as such. He was not a humanist critic in the sense of saying the human heart cannot be quantified, and that's what makes us human. Tarr's demand was exactly the opposite. He said quantification should be applied to all and every aspect of human social behavior, to all of our values, even those that not easily lend themselves to monetary equations. So the essential problem of neoclassical economics, in Tarr's view, was not that it quantified too much, but that it quantified too little, due to the exclusive focus on monetary measures at the expense of other human values that may well resist such quantifying measures, yet at the same time ought to be quantified as well. The whole human ought to be quantified, with all the heart. And if you can't quantify the heart yet, you've got to invent a better quantification system than money allows you presently. That was Tarr's criticism. Now, needless to say, Tarr's challenge to quantify all aspects and values in human life spells a daunting task for any science. But there have been repeated attempts by 20th century economists to develop such a comprehensive economic theory with mixed results, I would say. While some of these theories were able to move successfully beyond the impoverished notion of Homo economicus and towards a more anthropological, sound, and adept understanding of human nature, there were also other, far less promising, indeed dangerous theories that advocated an even more restricted, even more rationalized account of human life than that espoused by neoclassical economics. I want to give two brief examples for each. A pertinent example for the first group, I think a successful attempt, still in my own German, is the so-called Ordo-liberals. They were called Ordo-liberals because they're published in a journal called Ordo. And those were thinkers, Röpke, Rousseau, and others in post-war Germany who formulated the notion of vital politics that led to West Germany's embrace of soziale Marktwirtschaft, or social market economy. As I'm sure many of you know, soziale Marktwirtschaft is based on the premise that economic development should serve natural and self-evident human needs, or what the older liberals called the essence of the human, as opposed to pursue profit maximization and material affluence. Quote, "Vital politics enlists mechanism of economic coordination and regulation to serve life, so that economic measures are a means to an end rather than an end in itself." End of quote. Other attempts, however, to develop such a comprehensive account of human economic activity are downright dangerous, because they demonstrate the ethical perils hidden within Tarr's scientific demand for total qualification. I'm thinking, for example, of the Austrian economist Rudolf Goldscheid, whose theory of Menschenökonomie, human capital economy, from 1911 conceived of human beings as a particular kind of organic capital that ought to be maximized and nurtured using governmental regulations and economic rationales. Now, needless to say, this exhortation to conceive of human lives as an economic good or a capital investment sponsored by the state, Goldscheid himself actually meant this, I think, in a part. He meant it in a human. He looked at the poverty of the working class and meant, like, try to make an argument for the state, why the state has an interest in investing and keeping the proletariat and these people alive and serving better. But of course what happens is once you open and equating human life just as an organic capital as an economic good, as I think contemporary biopolitics or Bio-Capitalism does as well, once you do that, then of course you're entering a slippery slope where you can start legitimizing the genocidal biopolitics that characterized the totalitarian regime of the 20th century, to say nothing of today's jihadists and religious fanatics across the globe. Human life simply becomes a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Speaking of ends, I have arrived at the end of my talk. Yet this end nonetheless leads us back to the beginning. For it should be clear that my last comments regarding the total quantification of human life, as championed by Tard and other critics of the neoclassical model, has brought us back full circle to the ongoing debate about biopolitics I mentioned at the outset. Today's economic politics, I have argued, centers around biocapital. It is a politics about life itself, about life as an economic good, as life as a commodity. It's about making live and letting die, as Foucault put it, such is the power of genomic research today. My main point was that this politics of life put significant pressure on mainstream economic theory to abandon its irrational belief in rational man, and to acknowledge the biological constraints, but also the evolutionary cultural potential of human becoming. Building on a century-old tradition in economic theory, today's evolutionary economists have begun working on this task, but there are still many obstacles to overcome and problems to be solved. And first and foremost among them, I would argue, is the need for more interdisciplinary research in order to move us beyond the disciplinary isolation that continues to define academic research. Economic theory, for one, would stand to profit a great deal by focusing less on mathematical formula and more on the biological, behavioral, and philosophical insights and questions raised about how to understand human nature, human values, the human heart, as Tard put it. Conversely, I think that the current debate about biopolitics in the humanities might profit from being more informed by the economic tradition of formulating specific policies able to intervene and regulate global markets. In that sense, the humanities should be moving closer to the edge, no doubt, but they should also be wary of economic men trying to push them over the cliff. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have certainly time for questions, so about a half an hour.
I convinced you. What more can one do? Please.
Can you say a little bit more about the quantification of humans and Tard's argument just a little bit about what that means in terms of kind of modern social programs, in terms of the economic
in terms of social politics, matter of fact, that's a very, very good question. The one who has brought back Tard big time is Bruno Latour. For his actor network theory. Bruno Latour is a science studies person notoriously known for the constructivism debate and the cultural politics debate around 2000. Now, for Latour, what's important, Latour is not a traditional humanist in that sense, and his politics, I think, I don't doubt that he's well-meaning, but he's not particularly interested in social politics either. He's interested in dismantling, I think, the primary status of human beings in the world of actors. He's closely related to object-oriented ontologies, is a term that some of you may be familiar with, where he's basically arguing for a parliamentary of things rather than a parliament of humans. So there is a sense for Latour in which the important thing is that we reconnect, flatten, ontologically flatten the world in which we live. Don't put humans constantly at the center, but give agency to actants, as he calls it. That is, things that do things, or determine things in their passivity, maybe even in their activity as chemicals, as reactions. So the fact that Latour is the one to bring Tard back, to me already indicates somewhat that the question of how Tard's insistence his critique of the economic model can be translated into social politics is difficult, I think. I am not sure I know enough, but I have only read a couple of essays and then, quite frankly, Latour's book on it, which explains it very well. I'm not sure how you would translate that into social action. I think there's a problem there. And I just wanted to mention it's indicative, maybe, or symptomatic, that Latour is the one to pick this up, because his interests are different. His interests are basically saying, well, let's just look at the entire spread, and let's not look at the individual rational choice and maximization. So I'm not sure how to answer it. It would be interesting to see how it could be. The way in which it has been translated is with this human capital theory. But that is actually close to rational choice once again. It basically says, okay, let's look at how we can maximize profits gained from the investment the state has made into the single individual. That is a different, that does not, in my view, bode well for what it is that we want to do. But I'd have to check up more and read more hard in order to see how that would work out. Yeah, please.
In your talk, you mainly use the kind of the critique of the kind of evolutionary economists against the neoclassical. But I sense there might be a problem in some ways with both, in terms that both can basically lead to economics seeing itself as a science or a social science, and denying, which is always my experience with economists, that the humanities have anything to offer.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I think it is a problem that they are now replacing, one might almost say, a physical model. Physical mechanic, that's Newton. Supply, demand, you push, I counter push, you say it should be $10, I should be $5, $7.50 is what we're agreeing on in equilibrium. It's a Newtonian physics. And I think what they're doing is they're replacing it with the biological model. Now the biological model, though, and that's my only hope, it's a much more complex model, because it has feedback loops, it has jumps where suddenly, at an emergent, suddenly something is alive, suddenly has consciousness, has willful actions. Biologists struggle with that in their own discipline. I think the complexity of that allows the humanities to slip in more easily than we would be with a physical model, where it's just simply forces interact. But I completely agree. They have found now the new model, the biology as the Leitwissenschaft. It's clear that biology is and neuroscience, we could actually say, is the paradigm for academic research. I mean, if you look at the sponsoring going on in academic research now, where the money goes, how corporations have made up a lot of the dwindling state funds that have come been replaced by corporate funds. And corporations, of course, look for products that can be sold. So you have a incredible power given to genomic research and neuroscience right now. And it's clear that they're using that in order to draw from it. I think it's a step in the right direction. It depends on what that's a part I cut because I thought it was, now the hard work begins. Okay, so let's say we want to bring evolution into economic theory. What is evolution? Are we talking about cultural evolution, biological evolution? Are we talking about Darwinism or Lamarckian mechanisms? Are we talking about inherited qualities at the genetic level? Or are we talking about acquired traits that could be otherwise inherited or passed on? These are questions that biologists are struggling with, individual versus species arguments. There's an argument also that as species, it can be looked at as an individual. Once you do that, a lot of the biology nomenclature and basic theorems becomes questionable, because it's not built that way. My hope simply is that these complex questions allow for more disruption, if you will, in economic theory than the previous model. Please, Josh.
Maybe speak more to your personal take on returning to Darwin and providing a sort of different reading for leftist politics. Is there any potential for that activity?
No, I don't see any. It's an interesting. I don't see that. What has happened is that evolutionary biologists, some evolution, not as well, the usual Gould, Eldridge, people who have had big discussions in the 70s and 80s with the neo-Darwinians and the social biologists. A lot of this goes back to E.O. Wilson, certainly a brilliant Harvard biologist, who termed this term social biology. Basically saying, well, in order to understand the development of societies, we just need to look at how organisms and biological individuals survive. And so that was the social biology. It's very, very controversial. He was a lot of confrontation, physical confrontation happened. He was actually insulted and attacked, and he gave speech. So that's in the 70s. Evolutionary psychology comes from psychology, pretty much renews this in a more sophisticated manner. So what I'm trying to say is that these people have read Darwin. Evelyn Fox Keller, Elizabeth Gross have read Darwin very closely and show what is in that text, but they don't do so for primarily economic reasons. Elizabeth Gross is interested in sexual difference. Fox Keller is interested in understanding of genes and what legal complications. The economic hasn't been at the forefront. When economists read Darwin, they really pick up on the discussions that are already established in biology. They don't really, I haven't found any source. There's a journal of evolutionary economics. There's a whole journal, there's a journal of behavioral, there's meetings, group, symposia. I have not seen an attempt from an economist to go back into the text to mine that. It'd be an interesting project, but I'm not familiar with it.
Well, you don't think that project would have any value whatsoever?
I haven't read Darwin that way either, and so I'd have to go back and look at it again and see, with knowing a little more about economy, how that would work out. I haven't done it, so please.
Paulo Verno argues that the logic of excess that sort of undergirds post-Fordist economics is sort of self-defeating, that because capital is built on the presumption of more, that it ultimately has the potential to crumble. And I think that what's kind of interesting is to take that line of reasoning and put it onto this sort of bioeconomics, because the presumption is that life wants to continue. So is there any way of sort of reconciling that difference, or do evolutionary economists try to play with this almost like suicidal impulse that might be part of our current economic model?
Yes, they do. You may have heard that 3 people shared the Nobel Prize for economics this year. I forgot the second guy's name, from Chicago. Hey, forces of neoclassical economics. And the other guy's name, Schiller, from, I think it's Yale. God, yeah. And Schiller wrote a book. He got this Nobel Prize clearly for his prediction of the stock market crash. He wrote a book in 2001 called Irrational Exuberance. And if you recall, some of you may recall, there had been a lot. Well, I'm thinking also in terms of age. Economists, when the stock market exponentially swelled in 10 and 15. The fact that we're still again at 15,000, I mean 25 years ago we were on the single about 3,000-4,000. The rise of the stock market had been, and Schiller was one of the first people to say that cannot possibly be correct. It is not rational for the market to behave this. And that means that the people buying into the market are not acting rationally. They're acting irrationally. And so in his book, Irrational Exuberance, he says, he goes to different psychological predispositions, herd mentality, everybody's doing it, I should do it too. He goes and lists a lot of these examples that I've given, or one I've given, game theories, where he says, like, people don't act rationally. And he was given this award because in that book he said it's going to crash. It has to crash because there is no, this is not a realistic value. This is a money bloating bubble that has no real value attached to it, connected to it. Now, the Yava's response, this other guy got the Nobel, said like, sure, he was certainly right. He predicted the stock crash for 20 years. So his point was, if you're an eternal naysayer, occasionally you'd be right. If a broken clock is right twice a day, that's basically what he's saying. Okay, but that's Schiller would be, and a whole group of what they call behavioral economists would be exactly making that argument. They're saying this is not rational and it's going to crash, it's not sustainable. And I read only that book by Schiller. I haven't read what recently, he was interviewed, I read a recent interview by him where he was being asked, okay, are we now, since the Dow is again at 15,000 and the housing prices are starting to rise, is this again a bubble? And he was very cautious, saying, might be correct, might be adequate, I don't know. So by no means just repeated a mantra here. He's more cautious now. But yes, these people, I don't know who else, but there must be others. Make precisely your argument. Yeah.
Carsten, looking ahead to our first speaker in the spring semester, Deirdre McCloskey, who will give a talk, Humanomics, why neoclassical, neo-Marxist, and neo-institutionalist views of history and economics are wrong. So this will directly resonate with what you're talking about. I was wondering if you can give it a try to sort of triangulate between neoclassical and then sort of the views of neo-Marxists, because there's obviously been a long-standing critique from the Marxist tradition of the Adam Smith tradition of classical and neoclassical economics, and then sort of where your sort of standpoint comes in, because your standpoint is not, I think, like sort of like a straight-up neo-Marxist one either, right?
No,
like, so.
No, it's not. But I would almost, here's the neo-institutionalist. I don't know what that is.
No. Like I'm only about the neo-Marxist part.
I worry. I think let's take it from the back end. The reason, of course, why neoclassical economic position has been powerful and strong is because it hitches responsibility for behavior onto the individual. Okay, and so that's you're stuck with a bad mortgage, your problem. Nobody, I mean, you find that all when nobody forced you to sign a bubble lease that, or a balloon rate that just mushrooms into the double digits. So, and I must admit that and that's why I think I'm a little bit more on the liberal, I share some of that. I am also concerned about where to draw the borderline between individual responsibility and social community responsibility. It's a concern of mine. And so the best I can say is I have no answer to it, certainly because I'm not knowledgeable enough about economically. The talk is basically just saying neoclassical positions are irrational for all that, and to carve out space, and then I would really look at evolutionary economics and see what they are doing. That I'm not knowledgeable enough on the economic field to be able to then take this and do it on my own. I need to hitch onto others. So I'm sympathetic to the neo-Marxists, but the question then becomes, where do they draw the line between these forces? It's obvious to me that we had the debate during the last presidential election. I built that. Yes, I built that. No, you didn't build this alone. You may recall this was a big discussion. And I have to say, and it's a total lame answer, I see both points. I see both points. And so it's really super hard. I vote how I vote, but it's hard for me to I don't know. It's totally lame. Yes, please.
Is there, what's the role of psychological feedback in economic theory? You talked about the desire to implement biofeedback into economic rational thought, but what about the role that psychology plays in how people make decisions about their money and things that certain things make them feel good or not feel good?
All of that, absolutely, absolutely. This is what Schiller is all about. And there's also, not just among economists, but also I'm thinking here of the fourth generation Frankfurt School. Now, of course, he's a student of Habermas, a third generation Frankfurt School. But there's even in philosophy that we need to look less at materials and feelings of self-worth. And feelings of self-worth are clearly determined by what others are saying about us, about communities in which we live. So precisely those questions about what makes me spend, why do I spend, are super important and are neglected by economic models. And the perversion we talked about that is that no advertisement agency would be dumb enough to think that the consumer is making a rational choice. They know 10 times better. They got 5 psychologists, linguists, scientists working on how to manufacture the product such that you are seduced into buying it. So for them, economists, to say no, rational choice, the discrepancy is so vast. And that's what really struck me about it. It's a vast discrepancy between what the basic assumptions are and the constant working of the discipline around the fringes to try to modify it without, by nonetheless keeping it common time. So yes, Schiller would be somebody who does exactly that, and the whole behavioral group, they do have a journal. I just read a few essays by people. Yes?
Is it your sort of view that you think that these impulses that the average consumer puts into buying choices is something that is relatively innocuous or something that is ultimately very harmful? In other words, like you're talking about the impulse buying expensive shoes or purses at the department store. Or are you more of the mindset that people are so impulsive that they are actually willfully ignoring information that is given to them? Like if you're my mortgage broker, you're telling me that my mortgage is going to double and then triple, in year 3 and 4, and that the average consumer will willfully ignore that information. Clearly, that's going to be hugely problematic in the economy. That would require government and legal regulation to step in and make these corrections. But if you're talking about just, impulse buys, spontaneity, which I think something is sort of built into the market, as it stands now. I'm just wondering,
yes,
where.
I think the problem might lie with the assumption that we have to start looking solely at the individual and his or her inclination to do X or not. So to answer your question, it can both be benign and extremely harmful, but in order to determine how that is, you need to see what forces are working on the consumer to seduce them into, take the mortgages, everybody can afford the home, yes, you don't need any money down. I mean, these were clearly market incentives being given to people to afford houses, to buy houses they couldn't afford. They're responsible, but it's the problem then would lie is that we simply immediately go only to the individual. That can't be right, because then we cannot analyze systemic problems. We then simply have to go and say, oh, that's because we are humans, and in the end, it's your choice. And the solution can only be to look at what are the incentives given through government, to market forces, but also to government regulations and so on, to behave in a certain way. And that's something that we can politically steer. So to come out here, I'm very much in favor of government intervening within limits. We need to discuss about how markets behave, because there is no natural, this model of a self-regulating market is just simply a child of the 18th, 19th century. It's just a mechanistic model that I don't think holds today. Yes, please.
In this talk about systematic changes in markets and everything, is there a lot of discussion about, for lack of a better way to put it, a cost-benefit analysis, or a look at what's it called in engineering? Acceptable losses of parts of the population who can't or are unable to adapt to the new system, as far as recognizing how far the government should regulate. Is there a cutoff point where say, well, these people, we can only regulate so far, and then this group of people is just going to have to lose out and either disappear from society, move out of this society, or they're just going to.
No, I don't think quite in those terms.
Well, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
But, is there like an acceptable losses kind of viewpoint in all of this?
Every
systematic.
Every company is going to go and argue that at a certain price you have a price, and then you know, depending on where that price threshold is, you calculate how many population parts will be able to afford and not afford. The difference to governments, of course, is that the government shouldn't exclude any part of the population from engaging in this sort of exchange. So the question, I don't think a government should act like a corporation. It can't. But it should nonetheless, government regulations have nonetheless the task of establishing the effects of its policies. Yeah. But corporations can simply say we will lose this part of the mass consumer at this price. And it may be that that is nonetheless a good price for them because the profit maximization, if only 10% can buy a Mercedes, but it costs 100, it's still a better calculation than to make the Mercedes at 50,000 and let 50% buy them. Governments obviously should not and cannot do that. And I think the question you had, I think, goes, maybe I'm wrong, towards the healthcare or other concerns, particular regulations. I think you have to look at the specifics of the law. You have to look at what exactly the effects are of this particular piece of regulation.
Is it?
Courtney? I thought that when we were talking about biology and evolution with regard to economics, it seems interesting to me because it seems that biology and evolution, I mean, I've read a lot of Darwin and, I read The Voyage of the Beagle on the origin of species and stuff. And I'm really interested in the idea of taking something that seems to be an effort to observe something scientifically and have control sets and really think about something scientifically and then take that and apply that biological or evolutionary principle to economic behavior, where economics is something that we measure a little bit differently or a lot differently than we measure biological science. Mm-hmm. So instead of creating a hybridized science, if you will, it seems as though we're creating a different analogy for talking about economic behavior rather than hybridizing a science. That was my first thought. And my second thought is that we see willful ignorance all the time in the housing market, not just in adjustable rate mortgages, but anybody who's gone to get a traditional 30-year mortgage and has come in with their down payment sits down to sign their paperwork. And in the middle of this process is something called the Truth in Lending Statement, which tells you exactly how much you're going to be paying for your house at the end of your 30-year mortgage. And yet people you'll see them swallow very hard and then go ahead and sign the paperwork anyway. So it's almost as if there's something in human economic behavior that acts despite the data that we're given. And even though classic economic theory wants us to behave in such a way that we are rational, we have to make rational, irrational choices in order to survive economically. I mean, even renting a house is a rationally irrational choice. I mean, you're paying for something that ultimately you don't own in the end. That ultimately the improvements, any improvements that you make on the property are not yours. They're simply an aesthetic improvement.
Yeah. You shouldn't make any rational.
Yeah, you should. Rationally, you shouldn't.
Don't touch anything.
Somehow we all should water the grass. So I'm wondering somehow. I'm worried about making these links between evolutionary biology and biological studies and economics. And I'm wondering if it's not just if it's another analogy that drives us further away from some sort of positivist engagement with economics where we're able to quantify and measure things, that we have a desire within us, within our rational, irrational side, that keeps us from being able to completely quantify things and completely measure.
Let me ask you something just to make sure that you seem a strong advocate, or you seem to like, scientific models, quantification as something that should guide
I don't know.
That's why I hear you say.
I don't know if I like it. I think that there's a tension, and I think the tension is this: is that at one point we want to be able to measure things and quantify them, and by the same token, we seem to be searching out some sort of analogy or parable or story to be able to tell to make these things understandable, to make the irrationality of it understandable. And somehow, I don't know if the two things quite mesh up very well.
It's a good, I think I'm inclined to question the separation of those two. We just talked this afternoon about the rhetoric of science that I haven't pursued, but where the argument is made that even those who claim that the numbers speak for themselves, they have a nice little frame story around it that make it easier for the number to speak for itself. And so the question would be, to what degree is there ever any complete set, other than in mathematics? Now, mathematics has that. But mathematics, I would say, is not of this world. Or it is this world, when you're a Platonist and say that's the true world and everything. Mathematics is axiomatic and tautological. It's hard. Mathematics is a self-enclosed universe that most mathematicians say describes completely perfectly the real world. Thinking of Bourdieu, that's the world we actually live in. So other than that, I don't think there is a scientific quantifiable quantification method that is not some way or other linked to narratives, irrationals, impulses. And that's why I also particularly like the biology, but that's why I think evolutionary science is actually really powerful, because it presents this kind of, shall we say, this kind of fusion in a very productive, provocative way in its own science.
So then is there a way then, when we start to see equilibrium, for example, in economic systems, you can apply it, you can look at ecosystems and see the equilibrium in ecosystems
Absolutely.
too? Okay.
Absolutely. That's what people who are, I met once a guy who was really in charge for the Obama administration for the Everglades project, of trying to restore and really preserve the national, fascinating model of just establishing who are the interested players in this. Obviously, human population, American population, Floridans, politicians, business, the animals, and just to get a roll call of who has a stake in this, and then to say what is their stake and how does it compare to the. It was fascinating to me, and you're getting into hardcore mathematical statistic probability calculations, which, when he explained it to me, made perfect sense. Each symbol represented a particular stakeholder with a particular logic attached, and super complex. But that's exactly what they did. They will say, how can we maintain, so, and that was just, then you're talking, on the one hand, an ecological, biological equilibrium, how can we make sure that this part of the world is self-sustained, but then you bring the business community and the human politician interests in as well, it becomes a super complicated. So I was very impressed by that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't use scientific quantification methods, but I'm not sure that other than in purely mathematical worlds, and we will ever get to the self-evidence or the conclusions that we're seeking through these methods. There's going to be some kind of evaluation, basic value coming in.
Maybe on this we bring things to a close. If you have other questions, I'm sure Carsten will be happy to speak with you in the foyer for a moment. So thank you again. Carsten, thank you for coming. And again, the next event is in 2 weeks from today, November 7. Joshua Clover, a poet, social activist, professor of English, has written books on The Matrix and Bob Dylan and popular culture. So it should be interesting.